touch me again.
You'll be back. 3 months of overtime is a lot of money.
I'd rather stay hungry than sell myself. Please, God, don't let this be the only way.
Grace worked as an administrative officer for a manufacturing company. Her salary barely covered transportation. The only reason they survived was overtime. Every extra hour meant another meal on the table. Every weekend shift meant Daniel could print another proposal for another investor. Daniel dreamed of building a logistics technology platform that would connect manufacturers directly with transport companies. For 4 years, he had carried the same laptop from one company to another. Every meeting ended the same way. "We'll get back to you." Nobody ever did. Grace never complained. She left home before sunrise, returned long after sunset. Sometimes Daniel was already asleep. Sometimes he wasn't. One evening, she returned exhausted. She had only managed to buy bread and eggs. Daniel looked at the table. His face darkened. "This again?" Grace forced a smile. "It's what I could afford." Daniel pushed the plate away. "For how long are we going to keep eating like poor people?" Grace stared at him. "Daniel, I'm trying." He stood abruptly. "Trying? You work every day. So where is the money?" Grace looked down. "It goes into rent, electricity, transportation, food, and the little that's left helps with your business." Daniel sighed loudly. "I'm tired of this life." Grace walked closer. "So am I. But we'll get through it." Daniel's expression softened for only a second. Then frustration took over again. 3 days later, Grace finally gathered the courage to collect the overtime payment the company had owed her for months. Instead of signing the payment voucher, her manager locked the office door. He smiled. "I've noticed how hard you work." Grace folded her arms. "Thank you, sir." He walked closer. "I can solve your money problems." She frowned. "I don't understand." He lowered his voice. "Spend one night with me. I'll approve every kobo you're owed." Grace's heart pounded. She stepped backward. "No." He smiled. "Think carefully. I know your husband hasn't found success. I know you're struggling. I can change your life." Grace trembled, pushed past him, and hurried out of the office. She kept the secret for almost a week. Every time Daniel asked about the overtime payment, she lied. They are still processing it, but lies become heavier each day. That Friday evening, Daniel returned home visibly frustrated. He threw another rejected proposal onto the table. "They turned me down again." Grace quietly served dinner. There was only beans. Daniel stared into the pot. "Beans?" Grace nodded. "It's all we have." Daniel slammed the spoon onto the table. "I'm sick of eating like this." Grace finally lost control. "I'm doing everything I can." Daniel folded his arms. "You've been hiding something. We used to do better than this." Grace's heart skipped. She slowly sat down. Daniel waited. She told him everything. The unpaid overtime, the manager, the locked office, the proposition, the humiliation. When she finished, silence filled the room. Grace waited for him to stand, to hug her, to tell her she'd done the right thing. Instead, Daniel quietly asked, "He didn't force you?" Grace blinked. "No." So he shrugged. "What's the problem?" Grace stared at him. "I said no." Daniel leaned forward. "Grace, let's be realistic. He only wants one night." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Daniel," he continued calmly, "after that, we can pay our rent, buy proper food, maybe even invest in my business." Grace slowly stood. "Are you asking me to sleep with another man?" Daniel sighed impatiently. "I'm asking you to think about our future. It's just one night." Grace's voice shook. "So that's all I am to you? A transaction?" Daniel looked irritated. "Oh, please. Women do worse for less." Grace felt something inside her break. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I've spent years breaking my back for us. And today, you're asking me to sell my dignity. Don't you dare raise your voice at me. I call it survival." Before Grace could respond, his hand flew across her face. Slap! The room fell silent. Both of them froze. Grace slowly touched her cheek. In 7 years together, he had never laid a finger on her. Grace looked horrified by what had happened. "Why?" Daniel pointed toward the bedroom. "Get out of my sight." Neither of them slept that night. The next morning, Grace went to work. She kept her job, but she stopped working overtime. No amount of money was worth walking into that office alone after dark. Because she now left work at 5 instead of 9, she started getting home much earlier. One rainy Tuesday, she unlocked the apartment door quietly. Laughter floated from inside, a woman's laughter. Grace frowned. She stared into the living room. Daniel was sitting on the couch. Beside him sat an elegant young woman in a designer dress. The two of them immediately stopped talking. Daniel completely ignored her presence and didn't bother introducing her. She looked from him to the woman. "Who is she?" The woman smiled politely. "I'm Vanessa." Grace ignored the greeting. She looked directly at Daniel. "Vanessa is helping me," he simply said. Grace frowned. "Helping you how?" Vanessa smiled confidently. "I've introduced Daniel to some very influential investors." Daniel quickly added, "She's helping me secure funding." Grace looked at Vanessa, then back at Daniel. Grace walked past both of them without another word. She went straight into the bedroom and quietly shut the door. Inside the bedroom, Grace sat on the floor with her back against the bed. She could hear their muffled voices from the living room. Then she heard them laughing. Tears streamed silently down her face. For years, she had been Daniel's biggest supporter. She had celebrated every tiny victory, comforted every disappointment, encouraged him after every rejection. Yet, somehow, she had become the villain, while a stranger became his greatest cheerleader. She whispered to herself, "What happened to us?" Nearly an hour later, Vanessa finally left. Daniel entered the bedroom and acted like nothing happened. That night, they slept facing opposite directions. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She stared at Daniel sleeping peacefully while their marriage was falling apart. She made a decision that changed everything. Save any amount from her salary so she doesn't get stranded. Argue less with Daniel. Continuously pray for a breakthrough. Over the following months, Vanessa became a regular presence. Sometimes she stopped by the apartment. Sometimes Daniel said he had late meetings. Sometimes he traveled without much explanation. Whenever Grace asked, the answer was always the same. It's work. Grace wanted to believe him, but every unanswered phone call, every new excuse, every unfamiliar perfume lingering on his clothes made believing harder. Then everything changed. One Saturday morning, Daniel burst into the apartment with more excitement than Grace had seen in years. Grace! She rushed out of the kitchen. What happened? Daniel grabbed her shoulders. We got it. She blinked. What? The investment. Grace's eyes widened. The startup? He nodded excitedly. They are investing. They are actually investing. Without thinking, Grace hugged him tightly. I'm so happy for you. Daniel laughed like a little boy. We did it. For the first time, Grace saw the man she had fallen in love with, the hopeful dreamer, the ambitious young man who believed he could change the world. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. She thought, maybe this was the fresh start they needed. Maybe all the pain had finally been worth it. The investment changed everything. Within months, Daniel's logistics platform began attracting manufacturers across the country. Transportation companies signed on. Orders multiplied. The media noticed. Television stations requested interviews. Business podcasts invited him to speak. Awards followed. Money flowed faster than either of them had imagined. Daniel bought a new SUV, moved them into a luxurious apartment. Grace smiled through it all, not because she cared about the luxury, but because she believed the struggle was finally over. Success introduced Daniel to a new world, a world of CEOs, celebrity entrepreneurs, exclusive networking dinners, luxury lunches, private clubs, and in every one of those rooms, Vanessa was beside him. She managed every interview, every public appearance, every photograph. She slowly became known as the woman behind Daniel Cole's image. One evening, she adjusted Daniel's expensive suit before a television interview. She smiled. Remember, people don't buy products, they buy stories. Daniel nodded. I know. She straightened his tie. Then stop talking about poverty. Nobody wants to hear how difficult your life used to be. Daniel hesitated. But Grace, Vanessa interrupted gently. Grace belongs to your past. Your future needs a different image. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Vanessa looked directly into his eyes. You are no longer the man struggling in a one-room apartment. You are building a global company. Everything around you has to reflect that. Daniel didn't answer, but allowed the seed to be planted. One night, Grace stood in front of the television after Daniel's interview ended. The presenter smiled into the camera. One more time, congratulations to one of the country's fastest rising technology entrepreneurs, Daniel Cole, and of course, to Vanessa Reed, the woman many say has been beside him through this incredible journey. The audience applauded. Daniel smiled. Vanessa smiled. The program ended. Grace slowly switched off the television. A few hours later, the front door opened. Daniel walked in. as he loosened his tie. Grace? She was sitting quietly in the living room. You watched the interview. She nodded. I did. Daniel smiled. So, what did you think? Grace looked directly into his eyes. I think I have a question. Daniel sat down. What is it? She took a slow breath. Why do you never tell people you're married? Daniel looked away. What? Every interview, every magazine, every television appearance, they introduce Vanessa as the woman beside you. They call her your partner. They even call her your girlfriend. They congratulate her for your success. Grace's voice trembled. But not once have I heard you say, I'm married. Daniel sighed heavily. Grace, she shook her head. I need an answer. Were they lying? Daniel rubbed his forehead. It's not that simple. Grace laughed bitterly. It actually is. Are you married? Yes. Then why pretend you aren't? Daniel leaned forward. You don't understand how this industry works. Grace stared at him. Then explain it to me. He hesitated before speaking. Investors care about image. Grace frowned. What does that have to do with your wife? Daniel chose his words carefully. People expect founders to look modern. Grace blinked. I don't understand. Daniel finally said what he had been avoiding. You don't fit the brand. Silence. Grace felt those words settle like stones inside her chest. I don't fit the brand. Daniel continued quickly. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Did you invite me to an event and I refused? Daniel looked frustrated. So you let people believe she's the woman in your life? It's just business. Grace slowly stood. It's my marriage. You've erased me from your life because you are now famous and successful? Daniel didn't answer because deep down, he knew she was right. One evening, Daniel arrived home unusually cheerful. He tossed his car keys onto the center table and loosened his tie. You know what happened today? He asked. Grace smiled from the kitchen. Another investor? He grinned. Bigger. We've just signed another distribution partner in Port Harcourt. Grace clapped her hands excitedly. Daniel, that's wonderful. She walked over and hugged him. I told you your hard work would pay off. Daniel smiled. For the first time in years, I finally feel like we are getting somewhere. Grace looked at him for a moment. Maybe this was the right time. Daniel, I've been wanting to ask you something. He sat on the couch. What is it? Grace disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a worn sketchbook. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What's that? My old designs. She handed it to him. Daniel flipped through the pages. Wedding gowns, corporate dresses, evening wear, children's outfits. He looked genuinely surprised. You drew all these? Grace smiled shyly. Most of them before we got married. You've never shown me. You've never really asked. Daniel continued turning the pages. They are actually impressive. Grace's eyes brightened. I've loved fashion since I was a little girl. My mother used to joke that I'd rather draw dresses than do my homework. Daniel chuckled. I can believe that. She sat beside him. I stopped after we got married. Daniel looked at her. I knew your business needed every naira we had. So I put my dream aside. Daniel nodded absent-mindedly. Grace took a deep breath. I found a fashion academy in Lekki. Daniel looked up. It's a 1-year professional program. I've already spoken to them. I can attend during the day and still manage the house. I'll continue sewing from home too. She hesitated before adding, "I'd like you to help me pay the tuition." Daniel's smile slowly disappeared. "How much?" Grace mentioned the amount. Daniel let out a short laugh. "You can't be serious." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" "That's a lot of money." "It is. But education is an investment." Daniel leaned back. "No." Grace blinked. "No? We can't afford unnecessary expenses." Grace looked around the apartment. Her eyes settled on the brand new designer shoes by the entrance, then the luxury watch on Daniel's wrist, then the expensive suit he had worn home. She looked back at him. "We can't?" Daniel noticed where she was looking. "That's different." "How?" "My appearance brings investors." Grace smiled sadly. "And my education brings nothing?" Daniel sighed. "Grace, be realistic. You want to spend hundreds of thousands learning how to sew? It's not learning how to sew. It's learning how to build a fashion business." Daniel waved his hand dismissively. "Tailors are on every street. You don't need an academy for that." Grace stared at him. "I'm not trying to become a roadside tailor. I'm trying to become a designer." Daniel laughed. "A designer?" "Grace, do you know who buys designer clothes?" She answered quietly, "People who appreciate quality." He shook his head. "No. Rich people. And rich people don't know you. They don't care about your sketches." Grace's smile faded. Daniel continued, "You know what they care about? Innovation, technology, businesses that scale, not dresses." Grace looked down at her sketchbook. "So my dream is worthless?" Daniel stood and began pacing. "Look, every family has to prioritize. My company is still expanding. We're opening another office. I'm hiring staff. I can't waste money chasing hobbies." Grace slowly stood. "Hobbies?" Daniel shrugged. "Yes." She looked at him in disbelief. Daniel remained silent. "I never called your company a hobby. I called it our future." She held up the sketchbook. "And today, you've called my future a hobby." Daniel looked irritated. "Grace, why are you making this emotional?" She laughed through the tears gathering in her eyes. Daniel folded his arms. "I've already made my decision." "Not now." Grace asked quietly. "When?" "When your company becomes bigger? When you buy another watch that is same cost as the tuition?" Daniel's voice became cold. "You have to wait." Grace nodded slowly and turned to leave. Daniel spoke without looking at her. "Besides," she stopped, "I think you're too old to start over." Grace didn't respond. She simply walked into the bedroom and closed the door softly. Outside the bedroom, Daniel picked up his phone. Vanessa's name flashed across the screen. He smiled before answering. Grace heard the laughter through the closed door, and for the first time since they got married, she stopped imagining a future that included both of them. For the next few weeks, the apartment felt more like a hotel than a home. When they did see each other, their conversations were short and mechanical. The laughter that once filled their tiny apartment had disappeared. One Saturday afternoon, Grace sat alone in the living room, watching one of Daniel's interviews on television. The host smiled brightly. "Daniel, everyone has been talking about your incredible journey. Behind every successful man is usually an amazing woman. Who has been your biggest support?" Grace smiled unconsciously. She leaned forward. For once, she wanted to hear him acknowledge her. Daniel smiled confidently. I've been blessed with an incredible teen. He gestured toward Vanessa seated beside him. Especially Vanessa. She believed in my vision from the beginning. The audience applauded. Vanessa smiled modestly. Oh, Daniel, the presenter laughed. So, the rumors are true? Daniel laughed too. I'll let people keep guessing. The audience erupted with cheers. Grace's smile disappeared. Not once did he mention his wife. She quietly switched off the television. A tear rolled down her cheek. Not because strangers believed Vanessa was the woman in Daniel's life, but because Daniel had chosen to let them. 3 months later, Daniel's success reached another level. He bought a luxurious duplex in Ikoyi. Grace assumed they would move in together. Instead, Daniel invited her to meet him there. She arrived carrying homemade food, thinking they would celebrate. When the security guard opened the gate, she admired the beautiful house. It really happened, she whispered. Daniel walked out wearing an expensive suit. Vanessa followed behind him. Grace's smile faded. Daniel, why is she here? Daniel took a deep breath. We need to talk. Something inside Grace tightened. He handed her an envelope. She looked down. Divorce papers. Her hands began to shake. What is this? Daniel avoided her eyes. Grace, we don't belong in the same world anymore. She stared at him. What does that even mean? Daniel looked around the luxurious compound. My life has changed. My responsibilities have changed. So has my image. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. So, because you're rich now, I'm no longer good enough? Daniel hesitated. I didn't say that. You don't have to. You've spent months showing me. Vanessa stepped forward. Grace, nobody wants to hurt you. Grace turned sharply. I wasn't talking to you. Vanessa folded her arms but remained silent. Grace looked back at Daniel. Tell me one thing. When you had nothing, who stood beside you? Daniel swallowed hard. Grace nodded slowly. I know the answer. I just wanted to know if you remembered. Daniel finally spoke. I'll make sure you are financially comfortable. Grace looked at him with disbelief. You think this is about money? She held up the divorce papers. I mourned this marriage the day you asked me to sleep with my boss. This, she looked at the papers, is only the funeral. Without another word, she signed her name. Daniel looked surprised. That's it? Grace handed the papers back. I won't beg someone to stay where they no longer want to be. She turned and walked toward the gate. Daniel called after her. Grace! She stopped but didn't turn around. The rent for the apartment expires in 4 months. I think that should be enough for you to plan. Grace smiled sadly and walked away. She stood by the roadside with trembling hands as she searched through her contacts. She stopped on one name, Amaka, her closest friend since university. She pressed the call button. The phone rang. Grace? The moment she heard Amaka's voice, the strength she'd been holding on to disappeared. It's over. There was a brief silence. You signed? Grace nodded, even though Amaka couldn't see her. Yes. Where are you? Grace looked around. Outside Daniel's new house. I don't know where to go. Amaka sighed. I wish I could come myself. Grace's heart sank. But I'm in Abuja for work. Grace closed her eyes. I understand. But don't move. I'll send someone. Grace frowned. No, I don't want to inconvenience anyone. It's already arranged. Before Grace could argue, Amaka ended the call. She stood there, feeling more alone than ever. Cars drove past. People hurried along the street. No one noticed the woman standing, trying not to fall apart. Almost 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up beside her. The driver's door opened. Grace looked up, her eyes widened. Michael? Michael smiled gently. Hello, Grace. She blinked several times. What are you doing here? Amaka called me. Grace looked confused. You know Amaka? Michael laughed softly. We've worked together on a few charity projects. I was closer. So she asked if I could come. Grace stared at him. The last time they had seen each other was at a secondary school reunion years ago. Back then, everyone knew Michael had admired Grace from afar. He had never hidden it. But Grace had fallen in love with Daniel. Life had taken them in different directions. Michael noticed the hesitation on her face. Amaka told me to drop you at home. Grace nodded slowly and got into the SUV. Michael escorted her to the entrance of the home she shared with Daniel before everything finally fell apart. He reached into his wallet and handed her a business card. My number hasn't changed. If you need anything at all, call me. Grace accepted the card reluctantly. Thank you. Michael smiled. I meant what I said. She nodded. I know. He got back into the SUV. The SUV disappeared down the road. Grace looked at the business card in her hand. She slipped it into her handbag and walked into the house. She had no idea. Life was about to test her one more time before giving her a second chance. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She just stared into the darkness, praying for mercy. For the first time in years, there was no Daniel, no arguments, no disappointment, only silence. She looked around the room and whispered, So, what now? Her eyes fell on the old laptop inside her backpack. She smiled faintly. I almost forgot. She immediately switched it on. The screen flickered before finally coming alive. As she sat through hundreds of unread emails, something suddenly came back to her. Months after asking Daniel to sponsor her education and his refusal, she had secretly applied for scholarships at several fashion academies: Lagos, Abuja, Accra, Cape Town. She never told Daniel. Unfortunately, life became too chaotic. She never checked the responses. She whispered, I wonder. Her fingers trembled as she typed scholarship into the search bar. Dozens of emails appeared. Some began with, We regret to inform you. Grace smiled weakly. I expected that. She opened another. Rejected. Another. Rejected. Another. Waitlisted. She sighed deeply. Then, one email caught her attention. Its subject line read, Congratulations. Grace froze. No. She clicked it. Her eyes moved slowly across the words. Dear Grace Williams, we are delighted to inform you that you have been awarded a full scholarship to Lux Fashion Academy, Lekki. She stopped reading. Tears blurred the screen. She covered her mouth. I got in. She continued reading. The scholarship covered tuition, course materials, studio access, even accommodation in the academy hostel. Grace laughed through tears. For over 6 months, I've been accepted. She looked up towards the ceiling. You never stopped making a way for me. I just stopped looking. 3 days later, Grace arrived at Locke's Fashion Academy carrying her 2 suitcases. The hostel matron smiled warmly. You must be Grace. She nodded. Welcome. What took you so long? We've been wondering if you'd come. Grace smiled. I almost didn't. The woman handed her a key. Room 214. Classes begin on Monday. As Grace unlocked the small hostel room, she smiled. It wasn't luxurious. The wardrobe was tiny. The mattress was thin. The desk was old. But everything inside belonged to possibility. She whispered, "This is enough." The next year was the hardest of her life. The scholarship covered school, not life. Every evening after lectures, Grace worked. She altered clothes for nearby residents, helped a local tailor during weekends. Sometimes, she washed bridal gowns for a dry cleaning company. Other nights, she designed social media flyers for small boutiques using skills she had learned online. She slept very little, sometimes only 4 hours, but she never complained. Whenever exhaustion crept in, she remembered Daniel's voice. You are too old. Fashion is just a hobby. Nobody becomes successful making dresses. Instead of crying, she worked harder. One afternoon, during a practical session, Mrs. Bello walked around inspecting everyone's work. She stopped beside Grace's mannequin. She carefully examined every stitch, every seam, every finish. Then she smiled. Grace, where did you learn hand finishing like this? Grace answered honestly, online. Mrs. Bello looked surprised. For how long? Almost 3 years. The classroom became quiet. Mrs. Bello looked around. I hope everyone heard that. She turned back to Grace. Talent is wonderful, but discipline, she smiled. Discipline creates excellence. Months became a year. Grace graduated at the very top of her class. Graduation day finally arrived. The auditorium overflowed with parents, friends, fashion executives, industry leaders. Grace adjusted her graduation sash nervously. Mrs. Bello walked over. Are you ready? Grace smiled. I think so. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome today's panel of judges and distinguished guests. One by one, the guests entered. The audience applauded. Grace clapped politely. Then, the final guest walked onto the stage. She stopped clapping. Her eyes widened. Michael? He looked towards the graduating students. Their eyes met. Recognition spread across his face. He smiled. Grace couldn't believe it. What is he doing here? Mrs. Bello noticed her expression. You know Mr. Michael Lawson? Grace nodded slowly. We were friends. Mrs. Bello smiled. His younger sister, Olivia Lawson, is one of the founders of this academy. Grace blinked. What? Michael sits on our advisory board. He attends graduation every year. Grace looked back at the stage and waved at him with excitement.
The auditorium erupted in applause as the graduates stood to their feet. Grace barely heard it. Her eyes remained fixed on the stage. Michael looked different. His hair had a few strands of grey now. There was a quiet confidence about him that hadn't existed back in secondary school. But his smile, it hadn't changed. Mrs. Bello gently nudged Grace. Your name will be called soon. Grace quickly collected herself. Sorry. The ceremony continued. One after another, graduates walked across the stage to receive their certificates. Finally, the announcer spoke.
Our overall best graduating student. A brief pause followed. Grace Williams. The hall exploded with applause. Her classmates stood immediately. Mrs. Bello smiled proudly. I told you, your discipline would speak for itself. Grace slowly walked toward the stage. Her hands were trembling. She accepted her certificate from the Academy's president.
Thank you so much to the Fashion Academy. This is a dream come true.
Then she turned towards the panel of judges. Michael stood with the others to present the Excellence Medal. As he pinned it onto her graduation gown, he smiled warmly. I always knew you'd do something extraordinary. Grace laughed softly. I don't remember giving you permission to predict my future. Michael chuckled. You didn't, but I was stubborn. The audience laughed. One of the judges whispered into the microphone. So you two know each other? Michael smiled. We've known each other since secondary school. Grace added. And he used to follow me around during lunch break. The audience laughed again. Michael placed a hand dramatically on his chest. I prefer the phrase, admired from a respectful distance. More laughter echoed through the hall. For a brief moment, the weight Grace had carried for years disappeared. She simply enjoyed the moment. After the ceremony, graduates gathered outside for photographs. Parents hugged their children. Friends exchanged phone numbers. Grace stood quietly near one of the flower displays, watching everyone celebrate. She didn't have family waiting. Her mother had passed away years earlier. Her father had never forgiven her for marrying Daniel against his wishes. She was happy, but there was still a small emptiness. You deserve flowers. She turned. Michael stood beside her, holding a bouquet of white lilies. Grace smiled. She accepted the flowers. Thank you. They walked slowly across the academy grounds. Neither seemed in a hurry to leave. Just then, Mrs. Bello hurried toward them. There you are. Grace smiled. I've been looking for you. Mrs. Bello handed Grace a sealed envelope. It arrived this morning. Grace looked confused. For me? Yes. She carefully opened it. Her eyes widened. Inside was an invitation. Lagos Fashion Week, Emerging Designers Showcase. She looked up. I've been invited? Mrs. Bello nodded proudly. Only 5 graduates from across the country received that invitation each year. Grace couldn't believe it. Michael looked over her shoulder. I think someone has a busy future ahead. Grace laughed nervously. I don't even have a studio. Mrs. Bello folded her hands. Neither did many successful designers when they started. It's your ideas they are interested in. As they continued talking, a young journalist approached. Excuse me, Grace turned. I'm from Style Africa magazine. Would like a short interview. Grace looked startled. Me? Yes. Michael smiled. I'll wait. The journalist switched on a recorder.
Grace, one question. What kept you going when life became difficult?
I stopped waiting for someone to rescue my dreams. I realized every small decision I made years ago.
Preparing me for opportunities I couldn't yet see. People congratulate me for graduating at the top of my class, but my real education began years earlier. Every night after work, I watched free tutorials until I fell asleep. One last question. If your younger self were watching this interview today, what would you tell her?
I'd tell her, keep saving, keep learning,
keep sketching because one day the world will call you an overnight success without knowing you spent years preparing in silence.
That's beautiful.
As the interview ended, Michael looked at Grace with quiet admiration. He smiled to himself. The girl I admired in school has become a remarkable woman. Grace turned toward him. What did you say? Michael laughed. Nothing. I was just thinking. I owe someone a congratulatory lunch. Grace raised an eyebrow playfully. A lunch? Yes. No pressure. No hidden agenda. Just two old schoolmates celebrating a well-earned achievement. Grace smiled. After everything she had been through, she no longer feared kindness. She simply replied, I would like that. And for the first time, their journey forward began with respect. 2 months later, Grace refused to let her certificate become another decoration. Using the business plan she developed during her final semester, she entered a young creative entrepreneur competition. The interview panel questioned her for nearly an hour. Instead of talking only about profits, Grace spoke passionately about creating opportunities for women rebuilding their lives. 3 weeks later, she won. The startup grant, together with the savings she had accumulated while working odd jobs throughout school and a modest business loan, became enough to rent a small studio in Lekki. It wasn't luxurious, but unlike the house she once shared with Daniel, this place represented hope. Finally, the sign outside read, Grace Atelier. On opening day, Michael arrived with Ethan and Chloe carrying flowers and balloons. Daddy said we are your first customers, Ethan announced proudly. Michael smiled. I would like 3 custom outfits. You know I would have made them for free. Michael shook his head. No, your first customer should pay. He placed the payment on the counter. Grace looked at the receipt. Without saying a word, she framed it and hung it on the office wall. That receipt will always remind me where this dream truly began. She posted every completed design online. She treated every customer as though they were her only customer. Then, everything changed. A bride whose late mother's wedding gown had been damaged came to Grace in tears. Grace carefully restored the gown while preserving every precious memory stitched into it. The bride shared an emotional video online. Within days, millions had watched it. Orders flooded into Grace Atelier from across the country. She hired assistants. She trained apprentices. Most of them were women who simply needed someone to believe in them. Meanwhile, Daniel's logistics company continued expanding. Months later, his biggest contract began falling apart. Late deliveries, poor supervision. Everything Daniel had built began collapsing, one decision at a time. Soon afterward, Daniel's board hired an international branding consultant to rebuild the company's damaged image. After reviewing dozens of Nigerian brands, the consultant projected a single name onto the screen, Grace Atelier. The board members exchanged surprised looks. Daniel slowly lowered his head. One director asked quietly, You know the owner? Daniel swallowed. She was my wife. Silence filled the boardroom. A week later, Daniel requested a meeting. Grace agreed, not as an ex-wife, as the owner of Grace Atelier. Daniel entered her office looking older than she remembered. He looked around the studio before saying, Daniel lowered his eyes. I came to apologize. He admitted everything, laughing at her dream, refusing to send her to fashion school, treating her sacrifices as though they meant nothing, encouraging her to compromise her dignity, pretending he wasn't married, whenever it suited him. When he finished speaking, Grace remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she said, "Your apology cannot change what happened." Daniel nodded. "I know, but I'm grateful you finally understand." He looked at her. "Will you accept our company's rebranding project?" Grace smiled gently. "Of course I will." Daniel looked surprised. "You will?" "Yes, not because of our past, but because I've learned never to let my past decide my future." The rebranding became a huge success. Grace Atelier became one of the country's fastest growing fashion brands. Months later, Grace received the National Fashion Entrepreneur of the Year award, standing before thousands of people.
People often ask me when my life changed. They think it was today. No, my life changed years ago.
When I stopped waiting for someone else's permission to chase my dream. I studied with a secondhand laptop. I bought online courses one at a time.
I failed. I cried. I kept learning. And eventually, that opportunity found someone who had been preparing in silence.
Watching from his living room, Daniel smiled sadly, not because he wanted Grace back, but because he finally understood the value of the woman he had once taken for granted. Grace had learned from Amaka that Michael lost his wife over 2 years ago. For months, the relationship between Grace and Michael grew, not forced. They went for dinner, asked for opinions where it is necessary. Michael became Grace's backbone, always there to listen. Several months later, Grace closed her studio after another successful day. Outside, Michael waited with Ethan and Chloe. The children ran into her arms. "Auntie Grace!" Michael smiled. "I think they decided something." Grace laughed. "What is it?" Ethan grinned. "They think you're already family." Michael looked at Grace with a knowing smile. That day, Michael drove them to one of the best restaurants in Lagos. 3 days later, Michael took Grace to the beach after dropping the kids off with his mom. As they walked round the beach, enjoying the scenario, he reached out for her hand and knelt. "Grace Williams, will you marry me?" Grace was shocked and laughed through tears. For a moment, she stood still and looked at Michael. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." Counting her blessings, Grace looked back at her studio. Inside, hanging on the wall, were 2 framed reminders: her scholarship acceptance letter and the very first sales receipt from the day Grace Atelier opened. One reminded her that she should never look down on herself. The other reminded her that
always
every
dreamed of
great
this.
dream begins
And
with
now,
a single
it's
customer.
finally here.
She smiled, not because life had become easy, but because she had become stronger. If Grace's journey inspired you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next inspiring story. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. At what moment do you think Grace truly changed her life? Remember this: never let someone else's opinion become the limit of your future. Keep learning, keep preparing, and keep believing in yourself, even when no one else does. One day, your preparation will meet the opportunity you've been waiting for, and the life you quietly walked toward will finally become your reality.